Dear students, in this video we are talking about the orbit and the bony nasal cavity. That means you are watching now the fourth episode of this Kaarel demonstration. And before I describe the walls and the structures of these two cavities of the visceral cranium, I'd like to show you the bones of the visceral cranium itself. So I need the mandible back, like this. I have to fix it with this spring here. Good. It won't fall, hopefully. Okay. So what are the bones of the visceral cranium? We find here 6 paired and 3 unpaired bones building the whole visceral cranium. And between these bones we find so-called plane connections, plane sutures. So these sutures are also seen as mosses, but the shape of them is plane, like this. Okay, so what are these bones? In the midline you find the unpaired bones. Here you can find the mandible. In the nasal cavity you find the vomer and the ethmoidal bone, but these are not so good visible in this skull, so we have to cut the skull into 2 halves, like this. This is the vomer, and this is part of the ethmoidal bone. So back to the other skull. Okay, what are the paired bones? You see here the 2 nasal bones. You can see here the lacrimal bone, this one. This is part of the ethmoidal, but that is unpaired. Okay, so here the maxilla. Here you can see the zygomatic bone, and inside of the nasal cavity the inferior nasal concha. And if I turn it, you can see there the 2 palatine bones. Okay, now let's check the orbit. Of course, inside the orbit the most important structure is the eye, and of course the eye muscles. So let's see the whole. So the orbit is a pyramidal shaped, or I can say it's a cone shaped cavity of the visceral cranium, and the inlet of the orbit is here. It is a rounded square like this. And what are the bones building the inlet of the orbit? The inlet of the orbit in Latin is the additus orbitae, and it is surrounded by the frontal process of the maxilla, which is here. You can see here part of the frontal bone. It is called supraorbital margin, and the rest is the zygomatic bone, and here you can see the infraorbital margin. As I said, the orbit is pyramidal shaped. This is the base of this pyramid, the orbital additus, and the apex is there, the optic canal. Now let's see the walls of the orbit. The superior wall that you can find here has 2 main parts. It consists of the orbital part of the frontal bone. This, through this bony plate you can reach the anterior cranial fossa, there, deep. you can see the lesser ring of the sphenoidal bone, part of the sphenoid. The lateral wall, this is how you can see the lateral wall. One part is the zygomatic process of the frontal bone, another is the zygomatic bone with its orbital surface, and then you see here the greater wing of the sphenoidal bone, of course with its orbital surface. This is the aspect how you can look into the orbit in order to see the inferior wall. The inferior wall has one part from the zygomatic bone, and this is the body of the maxilla, the orbital surface. If you break this bony plate, you can reach the maxillary sinus. This is actually the floor of the orbit and the roof of the maxillary sinus, so it has clinical relevance. And deep inside of the inferior wall, there you can see the orbital process of the palatine bone. And then let's see the structures of the medial wall. I have to set the light, okay. Here is the frontal process of the maxilla. The next bone is the lacrimal bone. And then you see here the orbital plate of the ethmoidal bone. The Latin name is lamina papyracea because the thickness of this bony plate is really thin, and behind this bony plate you can find air-filled spaces. These are the ethmoidal air cells, and if this bony plate breaks, air can also go into the orbit and then can fill the space with air, which can compress the arteries or the optic nerve. So this wall has again an important clinical relevance. And then here deep you can see the body of the sphenoid bone. Okay, let's see the structures and the openings of the orbit. So first here you can see the aditus, the supraorbital foramen or frontal notch. In this notch or in this foramen you can see either the supraorbital or supratrochlear nerve. You are going to learn about these structures later in the neuroanatomy with more details. These are actually somatosensory branches of the ophthalmic nerve, but directly these are branches of the frontal nerve, and the arteries and veins just following the nerves are the branches of the frontal artery and frontal vein. Okay, so if we go medially, we can find here in the medial wall the anterior and the posterior ethmoidal foramen. They contain the similar name structures like anterior ethmoidal nerve, artery and vein, posterior ethmoidal nerve, artery and vein. The anterior ethmoidal foramen is a connection between the orbit and through the cribriform plate with the anterior cranial fossa. The posterior ethmoidal foramen is a connection between the posterior ethmoidal air cells and the orbit. We stay here. You can see here the fossa for the lacrimal sac. Inside of this fossa you can find the lacrimal sac, and here, okay, so here you can see the nasolacrimal duct inside of the nasolacrimal canal. The nasolacrimal canal is the bony part of the skull. Inside of this you find, as I said, the nasolacrimal duct, and it opens into the nasal cavity, to the inferior nasal meatus. Okay, let's go there to the apex of the orbit. This is the optic canal with the second cranial nerve, which is the optic nerve, and with the optic nerve you find the ophthalmic artery. The ophthalmic artery is a branch of the internal carotid artery. Here, laterally, between the lesser wing and the greater wing of the sphenoid bone, you can find the superior orbital fissure with cranial nerves and with a vein. What are these cranial nerves? Which are passing through the superior orbital fissure, and actually this fissure is a connection between the middle cranial fossa and the orbit. Okay, so here you can find the oculomotor nerve, the third cranial nerve, the trochlear nerve, the fourth, the ophthalmic nerve, which is the first branch of the trigeminal nerve, so 5 per 1, the abducens nerve, this is the sixth cranial nerve, and you find here the superior ophthalmic vein, which is a venous connection between the angular vein, this is an external vein of the skull, and the cavernous sinus. That should be here. Okay, and here between the maxilla, the zygomatic bone, and the greater ring of the sphenoid, you can see here the inferior orbital fissure with the infraorbital nerve, the zygomatic nerve, the infraorbital artery and vein, and here you can find the inferior ophthalmic vein. The inferior orbital fissure is a connection between the infratemporal fossa, and the medial part is a connection between the orbit and the pterygopalatine fossa. What are the other things that you can see here? This hole leads to the face. It is called infraorbital foramen. Before this you can see the canal and then a groove. It contains the infraorbital nerve, artery and vein. And here you can see the zygomatic bone on its inner surface. There you can see the zygomatico-orbital foramen, and on the outer surface the zygomatico-facial and zygomatico-temporal foramen. And at the end you can find here the lacrimal gland inside of the lacrimal fossa, which is on the lateral side of the orbit. So these are the structures and junctions of the orbit. Okay, let's see the next part of the viscerocranium, I mean the next cavity, which is the bony nasal cavity. The bony nasal cavity has its opening here, which is a pear-shaped here opening. It is called piriform aperture. Piriform means pear shaped. The surrounding structures, there you can see the nasal bones. On the two sides you can see the frontal process of the maxilla, and then okay, this part belongs to the maxilla, but it is called anterior nasal spine. If we go through the piriform aperture, we can see the two halves of the bony nasal cavity. Before I'm talking about the the inside, the inner surface and the medial and lateral wall of the nasal cavity, I'd like to show you the outlet of the two halves of the nasal cavity. So I just turn the skull, and now you can see here the choanas, because we have a left and a right choana. So the choana here is the connection between the nasal cavity and the epipharynx, and you have to know the borders of the choana. Here at the top you can see the body of the sphenoid there. In the middle you see the vomer. This is 1 ampere bone of the viscerocranium. Here, this one is called horizontal plate of the palatine bone. And the lateral wall of the choana is the medial plate of the pterygoid process. Here. This bony spine is called the posterior nasal spine. Okay, so if you look inside of the nasal cavity through the piriform aperture, you can see the bony nasal septum in the middle, and you can see on the lateral wall the concha, and the concha means shell. And I just want to describe these walls of the nasal cavity, but not with the skull. We have to use the half skull in order to show better the nasal septum and the lateral wall, and of course the superior and inferior wall. So let's do that. Okay, so I turn it and we start with the medial wall. Here you can see the vomer, and this is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoidal bone. This V-shaped cut is the place where the cartilaginous bony septum is attached to the bony septum, and here the bottom of the bony nasal septum, you see the horizontal plate. This is the horizontal plate of the palatine bone, and this is the palatine process of the maxilla. So let's open it and then look through this and then see the other walls. Now we start with the roof. Sorry, that was too shiny and that bleached out, but now okay, we can see that better. Here you can see the superior wall of the nasal cavity, this one. This is the cribriform plate with the small holes. It's a connection between the nasal cavity and the anterior scala with the anterior ethmoidal artery and anterior ethmoidal nerve. And the body of the sphenoid is also one superior border of the nasal cavity. The inferior borders, you can see here the horizontal plate of the palatine, and here the palatine process of the maxilla. And let's see the lateral wall and the parts of the lateral wall. So the two structures here, this is the superior nasal concha, and this is the middle nasal concha, concha nasalis superior, concha nasalis media. These are the parts of the ethmoidal bone, and here you can see the inferior nasal concha. Under these you find the nasal meatus's. So this one is called superior nasal meatus, under the middle nasal concha you find the middle nasal meatus here, and under the inferior nasal concha you find the inferior nasal meatus. The most upper part, or most upper meatus here, between the body of the sphenoid and the superior nasal concha, is called sphenoethmoidal recess. After I remove the conchas, these nasal shells, you can see the hidden parts of the lateral wall. Here you can see the ethmoidal air cells. We can divide them into three groups: the anterior, middle and posterior groups, and between them you find bony walls, septa. So this is the ethmoidal labyrinth together. The biggest is the bulla, the biggest cell, and in front of this you can see here the uncinate process. The uncinate process. Other parts of the lateral wall, the nasal bone, which is partly also one part of the superior. Here you can see the frontal process of the maxilla, this one. Part of the lacrimal bone is also visible here. You can see the perpendicular plate of the palatine bone here, with the here the sphenopalatine foramen, and this is the medial plate of the pterygoid process of the sphenoidal bone here. Now let's see the junctions of the nasal cavity, and I'd like to talk briefly about the paranasal sinuses. So first, the openings. The sphenopalatine foramen is here. This is a connection between the pterygopalatine fossa and the nasal cavity, and it contains the sphenopalatine artery and vein and the posterior nasal rami, posterior nasal nerves. Another opening is here. It's the roof of the nasal cavity, the cribriform plate with the olfactory phyla and the anterior ethmoidal nerve, artery and vein there. You see here the nasopalatine canal, the connection between the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. This is here with the nasopalatine artery and the nerve. Now, okay, let's see the paranasal sinuses. The paranasal sinuses are air-filled spaces which are in connection with the nasal cavity, and in one hand their function is to lighten the skull, and they are also resonance spaces. So in the if you speak, the air inside has it's a kind of amplification function, and as I said, they are in connection with the nasal cavity. So I'd like to show you all of these visible paranasal sinuses. We have here the frontal sinus through the ethmoidal infundibulum. It opens into the middle nasal meatus. If I build the concha as a superior medius and media and inferior back like this, I can show you again the middle nasal meatus here. Then through this I can show you the opening of the maxillary sinus. The maxillary sinus is the biggest paranasal sinus inside of the body of the maxilla, and its natural opening is called semilunar hiatus, which was originally the maxillary hiatus, but it is narrowed by the uncinate process and the ethmoidal bulla. But the natural outlet of the maxillary sinus is the semilunar hiatus. After I removed the parts of the ethmoidal bone, I mean the superior and middle nasal concha, we can see again the ethmoidal labyrinth with the ethmoidal air cells. Here we can see the anterior and the middle ethmoidal air cells. They trained into the middle nasal meatus through the middle part of the semilunar hiatus, that would be here. And the posterior ethmoidal air cells are the only one in paranasal sinuses which are training into the superior nasal meatus. But what about this one? In the body of the sphenoidal bone we find the sphenoidal sinus, and it opens into the sphenoethmoidal recess, would be here, and all of these meatuses are fusing and they open into the common nasal meatus, that would be here with the inferior nasal concha, that would be there. Okay, so it was the demonstration of the orbit and the bony nasal cavity. Thank you for your attention and good luck for the exam.